basic agenda. We're going to be talking about form permissions and permission rules. We're going to be talking about OpenAir scripting and then a little bit of best practices. As far as form permissions are concerned, the point of form permissions are to allow people to see various fields on the forms based on their role and based on their need. So what you have in OpenAir is you have the ability to manipulate a lot of the forms that are available to people, where you can say, I would like people with this role to be able to see these fields, and people with that role should only be able to read these fields. They shouldn't be able to edit them. And for people in this role, I don't want them to see this at all. And so it's completely based on role. As you can see here, it is by role. You can allow people to disable the delete and save buttons, and you can make fields required, read-only, or hidden. You can actually hide entire sections of a form as well. Now, we specify that you can set the location of custom fields. There's very limited in that regard. What you can do is you can say, I would like the first custom field to display after this standard field. But that's as close as you can get. You can't specify and put this field in between these standard fields. It's really only where do you want all of the custom fields to show up in the form. And then you can show and hide dividers, and you can add a form message. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. But the basic idea is you can display a message on the form that gives people either instructions on how to fill it out, warnings on common mistakes that people make, or even documentation on where they can find instructions on how to fill out that form. So form permissions, this is similar to a lot of the drop-downs and things that you'll see in OpenAir. Basically, these are some of the common uses that we've seen for form permissions with the customers that we've worked with. Disabling the task save button. So we want people to be able to see all the information on a task but not change it. Well, you can go through and you can make every single field on there read-only for that role. But the simpler option is to just simply disable the save button for those folks. Making finance fields read-only for PMs but required for finance people. So when you're setting up a user, for example, if you want to enter a user cost or like a contractor cost, and you want the PMs to be able to see how much their contractors are costing them, not be able to change it. Hiding integration fields. What you'll see a lot of times when we do integrations with NetSuite, Salesforce, etc., is that there are a number of fields that we need to put in there that hold information specific to those other systems, NetSuite IDs and this kind of thing. Really all they do is clutter up your forms. They're not necessary for people to see unless they're trying to troubleshoot an integration. And so that's something that we frequently will hide from everybody but admins. Moving the custom fields higher up the form, I talked about that a bit already. Adding dividers between custom fields. This is a good way to segment your custom fields. If you have a set of custom fields on a project that refer to the team that sold the project, for example, you could put them under a divider. If you have a set of fields that refer to the integration, as we talked about, you can set up a divider for those. And then you can hide and show things based on that divider instead of having to go and do it based on individual fields. That can be pretty handy. And then adding tips in terms of a form message. Okay, that's what we're going to, that's form permissions in a nutshell. Now we're going to get into permission rules. And then after we've talked through permission rules, we'll show you some examples in OpenAir screens of these form permissions and permission rules so you can see exactly where these things exist and what they look like. So permission rules. This is a bit more complex way of controlling what happens on a form. These are conditional based on specific pieces of data on the form. And so what these allow you to do is say, if the form, for example, let's say we're modifying a project. If the project has this criteria, then I want to display these fields. If it has that criteria, then I want to hide those fields and display these others. And so this is something that gives you more control over the form based on actual data that's on the form entity itself. So let's talk through a little bit of that. Whoops, too far. Okay, so conditions on a permission rule. You can compare drop-downs to specific selections that they've made. You can compare text fields to actual text, number fields to numbers, dates to dates. Basically, you compare all fields to any other field. It's pretty flexible. Now, the actions that you have based on those conditions are listed here. Show and hide are pretty self-explanatory. You either can show a field that normally would be hidden or hide a field that would normally be shown. Make a field read-only or make it required. Or you can actually hide and clear the field. So if you have a field that is pre-populated by default, but when a certain condition happens on that form, you want to clear that, you can hide and clear that value. You can limit the form fields to specific values. If the project meets a certain criteria, I only want these options to be available. And that can be really handy when you're dealing with things like a product line. You can look at a project and say, okay, this project is in the such and such region. This is in the North America region. I only want them to be able to select from this set of products that we sell in the North American region. I don't want them to have a product mismatch, for example. Another good example of this is on a user form. If you have a user who is an employee, you may want to limit certain values to these departments. But if it's a contractor, you may want to limit them to these other values or hide it completely. And then hiding buttons, we've talked about that a little bit already in terms of the save and delete buttons. So here's some examples of how these permission rules function. So here's a region-based example where we are hiding fields based on the region being Europe and Middle East, Africa. So if the region field is equal to EMEA and the project stage is not equal to internal, then we're going to take some action. And we know that it's an and because we have this all of the following here near the top of the screen. We can say any of the following as well, so we can make it an or. And then under here you see the actions that we have. And again, those are that perform action is the list that we just went through a second ago. In terms of had a question come through about hiding by custom field dividers, and yes, you can hide fields by custom field dividers as well. So that is an availability. Another example here, cleaning up internal project forms. If we have a project stage that's equal to internal, we don't want to see a projected end date. This is common when we see something like an internal project to collect time off and that kind of thing. We don't want to see a contract number because there is no contract or sales source, etc. So these are items we could hide. Now this is a good example of an any of the following criteria where we say if the project stage is equal to work complete or the project stage is equal to closed, then we want to make the actual end date a required field. Now you'll also see on the right here there's a custom message box that we can add that we say, there's a custom message that's going to be displayed if this action is not taken. So when this action is shown to be required, we'll display this message that says closed projects must have an actual end date populated. Now one word of warning on these. When you use these, they become dynamic on the form. What that means is that whenever you change a criteria on the form, OpenAIR's got to reevaluate these permission rules and say, okay, what should I show now? So for example, if you're on a project and you change the project stage to work complete from whatever it was, now OpenAIR is going to immediately, it doesn't wait for a save, it happens immediately. It's going to immediately reevaluate that form and change the fields based on what you have in the permission rules. That sounds great because you would want it to happen immediately based on the criteria that you've chosen. The downside to that is that it does take a little time. If you have a lot of permission rules and they're trying to do a lot of logic, you'll change the field, and then your user is going to have to wait there for a little bit. Their form will actually lock up on them for a few seconds while it makes its changes that it needs to make. So when you use permission rules, if you can, you're best off to limit them to just 2 or 3 or so per form. Otherwise, your users are going to have a little bit of a lockup experience and get a little bit frustrated. Another option here, preventing bad data entry by hiding the save button. So here we have a Salesforce probability greater than 1, and the probability is supposed to be somewhere between 0 and 1, so 0.25, 0.5, etc. So if someone enters a value that's greater than 1, then we're hiding the save button and throwing this message so that they cannot save the data with this error in it. Okay. This is one we talked about a minute ago, limiting the service offerings based on a practice, in this case, instead of a region, but it's the same basic concept. Here we say we're going to limit the values on this field, service offering, and then down below it shows what the values of service offering are, and we say we want to limit it to prepaid support and ad hoc support. So 2 sets of drop-downs on this one. One to select the field that you're limiting the values of, and one to select the values of that field that you want to be available. Employee versus contractor. Again, something we just briefly discussed. If the user type is a contractor, we don't need an employee hire date, for example. So we can hide that. This is an interesting one that we actually did for someone where we required that they put the words non-billable in task names if the non-billable flag was set to true. So what this says, it's in all of the following. So it says if the task name does not contain non-billable and the non-billable flag is true, so this is on a task form, then we hide the save and create another button. So they cannot save this task if it's non-billable unless they put the words non-billable in the task name. Frankly, I didn't think of this, but I thought it was pretty clever of these folks to do, because their point in doing this was to ensure that the people who are entering time saw the words non-billable on the task name, so they knew whether or not to put their time there. All right, last example here, limiting task type for non-billable tasks. Again, we're on a task form, and we say if non-billable is true, we can limit the values of the task type to just these 5, admin, approved investment, etc. Okay. One word of best practice on these permission forms. We talked about not including too many of them, but a lot of folks will look at this and say, yeah, that's neat. That might keep me from making a bunch of mistakes or keep my people from making a bunch of mistakes. Could help me here, could help me there. They'll get started on it. They'll get a couple done, and they'll realize that they have other tasks that they have to get done, and this kind of goes by the wayside. And the question that we get is it worth the effort? Is it worth the time and effort to go through your forms and put these permission rules in and figure out exactly what you want to do and implement it? And from my perspective, and I think any of our consultants would say the same, I think that's a resounding yes. The number of issues that you can solve or prevent from putting in these permission rules can be remarkable. We have clients that we spend a considerable amount of time helping clean up data or whatever when we first work with them. Many of the errors that they've encountered could be avoided through the use of these permission rules. So I would strongly recommend taking the time to sit down with your stakeholders and figuring out where are our biggest error points, where do we find people putting in data erroneously, and can we solve it through the use of some of these permission forms. Okay. That's all that I wanted to say on form permissions and customizations. Any questions on that before I move into scripting? Okay. So let's talk about OpenAir scripting for a bit. In OpenAir, scripting is available to allow data validation and manipulation, quote unquote, behind the scenes. The scripting engine in OpenAir uses standard JavaScript, but they provided OpenAir specific libraries to execute some OpenAir specific commands. Now, this is a key factor here. This is not your typical JavaScript or Perl or what have you, Python, where you can manipulate what the screens look like. Okay, that is not going to happen with JavaScript in OpenAir. That's not its purpose. It's not what it's designed for, and OpenAir has not enabled the ability to change the interface. So a lot of times when people use JavaScript, that's exactly what they're trying to do, is make various changes to the web pages based on conditional data or something. And that's not the purpose here. The purpose is to manipulate data in the database and validate data on forms. So there's two basic types of scripts in OpenAir. There's actually two others that we're not going to get into today because they're a little too deep and not something you'd use consistently. The major scripts here are form scripts and scheduled scripts. And form scripts are pretty much what they sound like. There's a trigger on the form that says anytime this form is saved, submitted, or approved, do this thing. Primarily, form scripts are used for data validation, and we'll show why in a minute. They can be used for limited data manipulation, and let me explain the difference when I say form validation versus data manipulation. Form validation is exactly what it sounds like. Is this form submitted correctly? Does it have all the right fields and the right data in the right fields? Is it what I want to see in those fields? Data manipulation is after something's already in OpenAir's database, we can go in and manipulate it and change it. Okay, that's the difference here. You don't want to use form scripts for data manipulation except in very limited cases, and we'll explain why here in the next couple slides. Scheduled scripts, on the other hand, run on a set schedule. Instead of having a trigger based on someone doing something with a form in OpenAir, they're based on a set schedule. They can be as frequent as once an hour, but no more frequent than that. And they are useful for data manipulation, and that's really it. Scheduled scripts are not going to help you in terms of form validation. They don't apply to forms. They apply to the data behind the scenes. Okay, so those are your basic types of forms. Now, before we get into when we'll use those and why and how, we're going to need to talk about OpenAir's scripting governance. What OpenAir has done, and this is going to sound like a restrictive thing, but it's actually a really good thing. And I'll step aside just a minute and give you a personal perspective. If you've worked with us in the past at TopStep, you probably know that we are pretty straight shooters. If we think something was designed poorly in OpenAir, chances are we're going to tell you, yeah, we're going to have to work around this because there's some design issues here. If we think something was done particularly well, we'll let you know that as well. And as far as their scripting engine is concerned, having used it now for the last year or so, I am really impressed. I think that they've done a fantastic job with this, and the scripting governance is one reason why, and that's what I wanted to get into here. Basically what they've done is they've put limits on the number of transactions and the time that scripts can execute. And the reason that they've done this is kind of like an airbag in your OpenAir system. Basically what they're doing is they're preventing you from killing yourself in terms of your data integrity, in terms of your performance. They've put limits on this so that you don't damage your own instance and you don't hurt your own users. And the limits are pretty reasonable as well. So it's a really good buffer. When you get into scripting or any kind of programming customization, you can cause real damage in an application or in a system, usually inadvertently, but even maliciously. And what they've done here prevents virtually any kind of serious problem within your database. So every command in OpenAir scripting takes a certain number of units, is what they call them. So examples here, if you just are reading a value off of a form, it takes 1 unit. Very simple thing for OpenAir to do. If you're writing an error message to the log, well, a write takes more processing power than a read, so that takes 4 units. Now, reading a value from a database takes a fair number of units because it's a fairly high, it takes a fairly high amount of processing power. And so in that case, it's going to take 20 units to make the call, and then for every record that you read, it's another 10. Okay, well, why does this matter? And do you expect to actually calculate all this? No, not unless you really want to, but it matters because of this. You're limited to the number of units that you can use with both form scripts and scheduled scripts. A form script is going to run for 5 seconds or less. If it takes any longer than that, OpenAir is going to kill it. It's going to throw a timeout error, say, sorry, can't do it, it's taking too long. Okay? And you also only have 1,000 units to use in a form script. Well, that seems like kind of a lot. And if all you're doing is data validation and saying, does this field match these criteria or something like that, you'll never come close to that. If you're trying to take a form field and compare it to something in the database before you decide if it's good or not, so you're actually doing validation against another entity, that's going to take more units. And an example of that is if you've got a user form and you need to submit something on that user form. Let's see if I can think of a good example. Well, one of the examples that we have later in here is where we take the manager listed on the user form and we find that manager's NetSuite ID and populate that on the user form as well. So it not only holds the user's manager, it holds the user's manager's NetSuite ID. It was really useful for an integration that we did. Well, in order to do that, what the script did is it pulled the manager name off of the form, which takes very few units. It's just reading the value off a form, so 1 unit. But then it had to access the database and say, find this user in the database and retrieve its NetSuite ID. Okay, well, that takes a lot more units to do. Now, in that particular case, we still didn't come anywhere near the 1,000 units because we didn't have to do a whole bunch of reads and we were just looking for one person. But you kind of get the idea of what we're doing here. A scheduled script can run for an hour, and it has 1 million units to use. I used to think that if you got anywhere near this, you were doing something seriously wrong. And then I wrote scripts that timed out. So you knew I was doing something seriously wrong, or it is possible to get up to this number of units. But again, this is all designed to ensure that all the processors on the servers that are running your OpenAir instance aren't getting killed by all these scripts that you're running. And so with these governance limits in place, you're very unlikely to see any degradation of performance whatsoever on your systems. Your users won't notice. You won't notice. There'll be some processing power being used to run these scripts, but it won't impact your day-to-day OpenAir usage. So it's really a quality design. Okay, so scripting used to be something where you would write a script and you'd save it to a workspace somewhere and do this and do that. In the 2014 release of October, OpenAir simplified this dramatically by introducing what they call the Scripting Center. And then in April, the April release earlier this year, they made it significantly better than it was when they first released it. And basically what this is, it's a container within OpenAir that implements that governance system and gives you some tools to use to reference, to show you how to build your script, and gives you a place to see the logs that come out of this. It's really useful. We're going to show you some examples of that here in just a minute. Okay, I'll just touch on this briefly. There is a deployment cycle within OpenAir for scripts to ensure that it follows through the testing procedures before it ever gets deployed. Basically what it allows you to do is write the script in your environment. If you have a sandbox, obviously that's where we recommend you start. If you don't, you can write these scripts in your production instance, and you can put them in a test mode so that a test user can use them without affecting anybody else. It's really clever how this works. So basically, you would move this into a test mode, and you identify a single user as the tester. And unfortunately, it can only be one user. We haven't gotten to the point where it can be 3 or 4 testers at once. But you identify, Jill is the test user, and when Jill does X, Y, and Z, the script runs. But when anybody else does it, it doesn't run. So they don't see any impact at all while this thing is being tested in the same environment that they're all using. Again, it's a very clever way of ensuring that you don't make a mistake and impact your users. Okay, here's what the scripting center basically looks like. You have your large text area in the bottom right where you put your script and you write your script commands. On the left, you have a number of different functions that you can use within the scripting center that will help you write the script, and we're going to talk about those here on the next slide. But that's basically how the screen is structured. The functions are these. The scripting studio, which you saw at the top, and these are just collapsed. So if you expanded these, you'd see what each one has inside. The scripting studio is where you identify that test owner. It's where you identify what the initial function is going to be, meaning that you can have multiple JavaScript functions in one script. That's what this is implying. And you just have to tell it which one is the starting function. So when I run this script, which one does it actually run, which function? If you want to build a library of JavaScript functions, if your organization is mature enough in the JavaScript universe that you can build some libraries, you can actually specify the libraries in the scripting studio as well, so you don't have to rewrite chunks of code all the time. And that's a topic that I'm not going to get into today because it's a little bit deeper in terms of figuring out those libraries. Okay, the next item is a SOAP Explorer. Okay, now that's just a weird name for here's what the data looks like behind the scenes in OpenAir. SOAP is a simple object access protocol technical thing that basically says here's how you can access stuff via web services. But all this SOAP Explorer really shows you is here's all the tables and the fields that are available for you to use. Okay, so you could look up what are the fields on a project by pulling open the SOAP Explorer and going to project on its drop-down, and it will show you all of the fields for a project. Really handy. It's a nice way of looking at the data dictionary. The Functions Explorer is pretty much what it says it is. It shows you all of the OpenAir specific JavaScript functions. In other words, all the ones that NetSuite wrote for OpenAir data manipulation. It's not going to show you all the JavaScript functions that there are because JavaScript being a standard, there's other references you can use. All it's showing you is the NetSuite specific JavaScript functions in that Explorer. And it shows you their syntax, what they do, how to use them. Script parameters I am not going to get into. Basically, they allow information to be passed to the script at runtime. It's more complicated than we want to delve into today. Terminology is instance-specific terminology. So if you've gone in and you've changed the word customer to client everywhere in your system, this will show you the changes that you've made. This will show you, oh, this is what you call it. So it'll help you identify what you want to call fields based on how you've changed their names. Okay, I put this in here for reference material. I'm not going to go into this. These are the basic libraries that OpenAir has provided for its JavaScripting. They just serve different purposes. We'll get into some examples of how to use these here in just a minute. All right, so with all that said, here's an example of a form script. So one of our clients asked us to not allow a timesheet to ever have a negative value as an entry. They didn't do adjusting timesheets. They didn't want that. And they were having some problems with subcontractors entering negative values on one project and positive on another, and it wasn't passing over to it was breaking their integrations is what it was doing. And so they asked us to put something in place that would keep negative values from appearing. And so this is the entire script right there. You're looking at the entire thing on the right. what we did is we went into the scripting center and we used the green plus that everybody is so familiar with in terms of creating anything new in OpenAir. When we clicked on the green plus, we get a list that you can see part of on the left of all the different forms you could add a script to. The booking form and the charge form and the project form and the receipt form. And just like if you go into reporting and you get a list of templates that's a mile long, you have a similar situation here. You have a lot of different forms that you can add scripts to. It's just a matter of figuring out the right one. Well, in this case, what we were trying to do was monitor time entries themselves. So we picked the time entry form script. And then once we did that, we built this script. We made a function call, and I'm not going to go into JavaScript 101 too much, but basically when you make a function call, a function definition in JavaScript, you precede it with the word function, and then you give it a name, and that name can be anything. In this case, I called it identify negative values. The next line says I'm going to create a variable called total, and I'm going to use this weird NSOA thing to get the value of that. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, I'm ashamed to admit that it took me a while. NSOA stands for NetSuite OpenAir. Yeah, that took me a while to figure that out. Basically what that means is that I'm going to call a function that is NetSuite specific. This is not a standard JavaScript function. It's written in the same terminology, but it's something that only works in NetSuite OpenAir. So I'm calling this form library, and the form library is where all of the commands that you would use to get data off of a form exist. And I said, okay, I want to get the value of this field. Okay? So I set up a variable. I call it total. And again, this first total, I could have named that anything I wanted. And I say, call this function nsoa.form.getValue, and the parameter that I want to receive is also called total. That's by coincidence. Okay? They're not the same variable. Now, where did I get this? How did I find this all? This is going back to what we talked about in terms of the Function Explorer. This would show you, the Function Explorer would show you this NSOA form.getValue, and it would show you this is what you use to get a value off the form. Okay? And then there's a Form Explorer in there as well that you can use to see what are the form fields on this form, and you can pick the one you want. All right, so that goes back to, let me show that screen again really quick. These areas here on the left. Okay, once you expand those, you see all these definitions of, here's a list of all the functions, here's a list of all the fields, etc. Okay, so that's where you can get that information from. Now my next line is also NetSuite OpenAir specific, but this is calling something from the Meta library. Well, Meta is just a way to add logs and errors. That's all it's used for in OpenAir. And so I said I wanted to use a log. I wanted it to be a trace log, which I'll explain what that means in a little bit. And I wanted it to say the total is, and then the value of the variable total. So now I'm writing that total to the log. Does that do anything in OpenAir? No, it doesn't do anything except put that in a log somewhere where I can then go read it later to make sure this thing works the way I want it to. There's a reason that I use the trace level, and I'll talk about that here as we get toward the end of the presentation. But just keep that in mind, that that's what I put here. That's going to be kind of important in a bit. So then the last piece here basically says if the total is less than 0. So in other words, if the value that I pulled off that form from the total field, which is the individual cell, if that value is less than 0, i.e. negative, then throw an error message. Okay? And again, this is a NetSuite specific call. It's in the form library. It's the error, and first thing I put in here is the word total, which is the field that I want this error to show up next to. And then I put the actual error message next to it. That's all I had to do. We put this in place. We deployed it in the client system. Now, anytime somebody tries to put a negative value in the time entry, they get this error message that tells them they can't do it. Okay? And by making this an error in this NSOA.form, it prevents them from saving this until that's resolved. So I didn't have to put anything in here that says hide a save button or anything like that. Just putting that error message right there, that nsoa.form.error, prevents this from being saved. Okay? So that is as basic a form script as you'll probably ever see, but pretty darn useful for these folks in particular. And there's a lot of different things you can do with this. This is where you can build something similar to say, I want to make sure that nobody puts in an expense that's, maybe you don't require receipts for expenses less than $5 or something. And rather than having somebody enter them, you just put a rule in place that says if it's less than $5, just don't save it. We don't want it on there. Or if it's greater than $100, maybe you need to have more information on that expense receipt. And so you could use this exact same kind of form script to say, if this value is greater than 100, make sure that this value of this other field is populated, and et cetera. Okay, a lot of things you can do with this. All right, now a scheduled script, I did not put an example of a scheduled script in the presentation because it would not have been readable. The form script here took 10 lines of code. The scheduled scripts are a bit heftier. But here's some examples of what we've done with scheduled scripts, and you do it in essentially the same fashion. Some of the things we've done for some of our clients just recently, in fact, one of these I just finished yesterday. One of the things we did, people at this particular customer were filling out the planned hours on their tasks, and they wanted the budget hours on the project, the budget hours field, to match what they put in on the planned hours field on the task. Well, what they were having to do was go into the tasks and put their planned hours and do their project management at the task level, and then go back and sum all of those up, by hand or through a report or something, and then go enter that into the budget hours field on the project. Well, this was a customer who had 100, 200 tasks on each project, and it's hard enough to manage those and keep the planned hours up to date on that many tasks. They found that a lot of times those planned hours were not in sync with their budget hours. And so what they asked us to do was automate this so that they didn't have to populate that budget hours field manually anymore. And so we built a script that ran through every project where a task had been updated in the last 48 hours or so. And we said, okay, now on all of those projects where something has changed, sum up the planned hours, put it in the budget hours field. And we set this to run, I believe it runs twice a day. So that's the kind of thing that you can do, automating the population of fields. We did something very similar, and this is the one I just finished yesterday or earlier this week at least, where we took the we put a custom field on the budget lines on a project. Now, for those of you familiar with the budget functionality in OpenAir, it allows you to put dollar amounts based on various events that happen on the project. So the original contract is signed, you put in a budget line for $20,000 for that original project. Then you get a change order for another $5,000. You put in another budget line for $5,000. But what it didn't have in there was a built-in hours field. And so they wanted to associate hours with those, so we built a custom field. Put the hours, they would put the hours in that custom field. And then we did another script that summed up the values in that field and put that in the budget hours field on the project. So that was always in sync with their budget line items. Another client had a workflow that depended on their invoices being marked as sent. And so at the time, the project managers would mark, once they approved an invoice, they would then go back and manually change it to sent status. Or they'd forget and not do it, and their workflow would fall apart because they were reporting on this sent status and doing things on this sent status, and it wasn't set. And so we put in an automated script that marks those as sent once they're approved. copying a field on a project's properties to every charge associated with that project. This was an integration thing. They wanted the Salesforce ID on the project to show up on all of the charges on the project as well. So we added a script that would automatically do that. And then this last one I thought was particularly interesting. This customer had a few fields on their project for specific date milestones. So they wanted to know when the prototype was going to be complete, when the UAT would be complete, etc. And they had specific tasks in their project plans that identified that. And so this was another situation where they were maintaining the tasks in the project, and then they would have to go and update the tasks or the dates on the project as well. And so what they did instead was we put a little drop down where they could say, this is the prototype complete milestone, this is the UAT complete milestone. And then when they do that, the script will go through and find those and update those dates on the project instead. Okay. So we got a question in about using a script to copy a customer field value from a time entry to its associated time bill or charge. And the answer to that is absolutely. That's exactly what these scripts are designed for. Being able to pull a field from X when it normally wouldn't be on Y and populating it on Y. Or performing some kind of a calculation, doing some kind of validation. Anything that you want to do with the data behind the scenes in OpenAir, you should consider doing with a script. Now, when I say consider doing, notice I didn't say you should just do it with a script. You should consider doing it with a script. OpenAir, again, in a move that I think is pretty wise, they have not exposed every data item in their database to their scripting tool. Okay? There are some things you cannot touch. Very few, frankly. I've run into only a small handful of things I wanted to change that I can't. So that's just something to be aware of. You may not be able to script it. So just be aware of that. Got another request in for showing an actual scheduled script that hits a database, and I intend to do that, but I need to wait till we get toward the end of the presentation. In terms of entities that I found that I wasn't able to touch, I was trying to change one of the enhancements requests that I put into OpenAir when I first started using the tool 10 some odd years ago. As an administrator, I was getting really tired of having to go add somebody to my proxy list every time I wanted to proxy in as somebody new, because I was having to proxy in as people all the time. This person didn't approve their timesheets and they went on vacation, so I need to proxy in as them. Well, in my view, and I still believe this, an administrator should be able to proxy in as anybody anytime. But in OpenAir, as many of you already know, you have to add that person to your proxy list, and if you want to proxy in as them. Well, I was managing an instance of 3,000 people at one point, and that was painful. So what I tried to do through scripting was put something on the user form that says anytime a new user is added, add it to my proxy list. I don't have to do it myself anymore. Well, guess what you can't do in OpenAir scripting? For security purposes, the proxy data is locked off. So that's an example of something that I couldn't change. Another example is the reports table. You can read things from the reports table, but you can't change them. So if you wanted to, and what I was trying to do was change a report based on who was running it. So doing something kind of tricky, and I was prevented from doing so by that. In terms of, okay, got another question in terms of how scheduled scripting is better or worse than running your own programs against OpenAir's API. All I would say to that is that there's frankly, I don't see a whole lot of difference. If you have the capability and you have the skill set of people in-house that can understand OpenAir's API through C programming or Java or whatever it is that you're using, C++, I mean, that's not a whole lot different than going through scheduled scripts. In fact, it's probably going to save you performance time because you don't have the overhead that OpenAir puts around the scripting center. You're still using their API, and so you're still subject to a lot of their, I'll call them restrictions, but their safeguards, if you will. They've still kept it so you can't really cause much damage. So in terms of scripts over an in-house program that uses the API, I'm kind of the opinion that it's 6 of one, half dozen of another. I do like that the Scripting Center gives you the opportunity to, basically forces you through the testing process. They've got a good workflow there. Because it's right there in OpenAir, you can access it from anywhere you can access OpenAir. So you can kill scripts or run scripts on demand anytime you want. Whereas with an in-house program, you may have to go on the VPN and get to a server if you want to manipulate something. So I think there's a trade-off there, but I don't think it's all that significant, frankly. All right. Just a few best practices. I'll go through some of these pretty quick. In terms of form permissions, what we recommend is that you go through at least these 6 forms if you're using them, audit them now, and get them the way you want them, and then you don't have to touch them again until a new role is created, because that's how the form permissions work. They're based on roles. There are some backdoors in terms of form permissions, basically forms where they don't apply. And then that's mostly listed here. Any of these newer worksheet views that OpenAir has put in, they don't apply. Question coming in terms of where the form permissions are edited, there's 2 ways you can do it. There is the little info box. Let me go back to that. I don't know what people call it. We tend to call it the info icon, but I think people have different names for it. Of course, can I find it now? I'm sorry, I think I went too far. But basically, it's the little chat looking box right there under the green plus. When you're on a form, if you click that click that little icon, the info icon, you'll get a little window that has some information on it. It also should have a command that says modify the form permissions and a link right there if you have the permissions to it. The other place is there at the top of OpenAir's screen when you're in the administration module. Now there's a customization link up there that allows you access to all of the forms from one menu. That can be nice. I still use this method because I'm usually on the form that I want to modify. So again, be aware of these back doors where people can actually avoid the form permissions if they're using these. Best practice, self-documenting forms. This is something I talked about briefly. If you want to put links to your internal website that show, here's an example of how to fill out this form, you can do that in those form messages. And we've had clients that have used that to great extent and found it to be really helpful. Just makes it makes their users much less likely to fill things out incorrectly. As far as scripting is concerned, the biggest best practice I can give you is use your references. And these are the 4 or 5, I guess, that I use. And I've gotten to the point now where I'm probably spending half my day every day scripting something or another for someone. And I live by these. The first one is the OpenAir Scripting Guide, which is at that link. Now, any of you that were on webinar that I did a while ago found out that I was giving you links that didn't work because I was pulling them from some old documentation. And so I went back and tested these myself and made sure that they worked. So that's the OpenAir Scripting Guide. You can also get to it from that little info icon that we just showed you. When you're in the Scripting Center, if you click on that, it will get you a link to the Scripting Guide. And OpenAir has done, again, in the interest of my personal opinion, OpenAir has done a really good job with that Scripting Guide. I've seen, I think, 1 typo in there, and everything else has been not only exact, but extraordinarily useful. So I keep that thing open all the time. The data dictionary, even though you can access it through the SOAP Explorer on the Scripting Center, like I mentioned, I still keep the data dictionary page open because I'm just used to it. The JavaScript reference site. Now, I don't know if I should be plugging another organization's JavaScript reference, but I did anyway. This is the best reference that I know of out there. It's from www schools, W3 schools, and it's free and extraordinarily useful. It's got examples and little places where you can try things and this kind of thing. And then the SOAP Explorer and the Functions Explorer we talked about. A couple other questions coming in terms of conflicts between form rules, field settings, and JavaScript. Oh yeah, absolutely. If you set form permissions one way and then you JavaScript it another way, frankly, I don't know what would happen. But you can absolutely do that. OpenAir won't prevent you from doing that. I believe that the form permissions and permission rules take precedence. Based on what I understand of OpenAir's architecture, I would expect that to be the case. But I can't say for sure. Haven't done it. But I know you could definitely write conflicts in where you're telling your form permissions to do one thing and your JavaScript to do something else. OpenAir will not prevent you from doing that. So you do have to be careful. In terms of cross-site scripting, let's just say no on that one. And then in parentheses, I'll say, yeah, you actually can. I've done it. I don't recommend it. It's, first of all, you can't do it through the scripting center. You end up doing it through form messages is where I did it, actually. I slammed some script code into HTML in the form message and did it that way. And no sooner did I have it in there than I had to pull it out because it was only you end up getting some issues with browser differences in that case. Internet Explorer acting one way versus Chrome versus Mozilla, etc. So whereas you might be able to do it, I certainly don't recommend it. Okay. Sorry, getting a few more questions here. Can we write HTML and JavaScript codes in form scripts? Certainly JavaScript code. HTML, I don't think so. Again, the scripting, I can't say I've ever tried it, but the scripts in OpenAir, the scripting center is not designed to do any manipulation of the screens or the forms themselves. So I don't think HTML is going to get you anywhere in those scripts within the scripting center. But again, I haven't tried it. Calling external web services from JavaScript, I have not heard. I know you can't do that right now. I have also heard the user indicated that they said that would be something that you could do at some point, and I have heard that as well. At this point, that ability is not there. All right, one more slide here, just in terms of best practices. This is what I talked about a little bit earlier in terms of scripting logs. We have 5 levels of script logging, where you can say, this is an error, it's a warning, it's just info, it's debug information, or it's trace information. And then what you do is you actually set the script in the scripting center to a certain level of error logging. And so you can say, once this is in production, I only want to see errors that are, of error warning or above, which would be warning or error. By default, info is the default logging status, so you'll see anything that you write into your code as an info, you'll show up. But you'll recall in my code, I had that meta listing, the log listing, as a trace, which meant I really only wanted to see it while I was still doing development. Once I put that into production, the script was set at an info level, and it would only show logs that were listed as info, warning, or error, so info or above. And so none of that code that I put in there that was marked as log as trace would run in production anymore, which is exactly what I wanted. I didn't need to fill up a log full of a whole bunch of junk while the thing was in production. I really only wanted it there while I was still developing. So that's that. Okay, we still have 5 whole minutes. Any questions that I can answer? I realize we kind of blew through this pretty quickly. Oh, and we did have somebody ask to see an example of a form or a scheduled script. Let me see if I can do that really quickly. I have one available. It's just a matter of figuring out how to share it. Bear with me for just a minute. Of course, I need to remove the customer name from this. All right. unfortunately, I don't seem to be having luck getting this to share. So I saw the note from the user. I will send out an example of this so you guys can see one that actually does manipulation in the database. I apologize that I'm not able to share one at the moment. In the interest of time, I don't think, well, actually, you know what? Let me try this. Here I say I can't do it. Now I'm about to try it anyway and waste everybody's time. How about that? Can you guys see this? Oh, gosh.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. This is an example of a script, a scheduled script that we did that the client had a project stage that they called stalled. So when a project got put on hold for whatever reason, customer wasn't ready, or the client didn't have the resources available, whatever, they'd move it to this stalled project stage. And what they were looking for was a report that showed them how long a project had been in that stalled stage. Well, you could run an audit trail and see when it changed stages, but you can't get that in a report. And so what we did is we put this in place to look at when a project was newly moved, this thing would run every night, and it would say, did any projects move to that stage today? And if they did, do such and such. Okay? And so that was kind of the basic idea behind that. And here's where the modification to the database comes into play. So basically it's saying we checked the project, and if there was no update, we populated this thing called no update. But if that update flag was not equal to no update, then we pulled this little trick here, which said update the database. That's what this NSOA was, WS API, Web Services API is what that stands for, .modify. That's what that command does. You send it a set of attributes, and these are defined in the NetSuite integration, or I'm sorry, the OpenAir scripting documentation. You send it a set of attributes. In this case, we wanted to tell it that we were updating a custom field, because you can't update a custom field unless you send that attribute. You have to tell it that you're doing that. And then we sent it the criteria that we were updating, and that's specified in this updated date array, which is basically, it's in a few places, but basically what we're saying is here we set the ID of the record that we were trying to update. So it knew which record to update. So it says, okay, I'll find the one that has that ID. And here we said, here's what we want to update it with. If it met certain criteria, we would update it with this, the year, the month, the day. If it had moved out of that stage, we wanted to clear it. And that's what this is doing. Okay, so if you're not a JavaScript, if you're not familiar with JavaScript, this probably looks like hieroglyphics. But if you are familiar with it, this should be fairly straightforward. The only tricky thing about this was dealing with dates in OpenAir can be a bit of a nasty. Dealing with dates in JavaScript can be a little bit nasty. For whatever reason, and this is just a JavaScript anomaly, if you use, so what this command does right here is it establishes a new variable called today. And I could have called that anything I wanted, but I called it today. And when I say make it equal to new date, what it does is it makes that an object with today's date in it. Okay, so not specifying a date sets it to today's date. So then I said I want to pull out the year, and the way to do that is to use the get full year function off that object. Okay, great. That gives me the correct year. Same thing with the day. If I use the get date, I get the correct day. So if I did this for today, I would get 2015 in this variable. I would get 17 in this variable. And for month, if I just said get month, and I didn't use that +1, I would get August. Because the way JavaScript does it, day goes from 1 to 31, year starts counting at 1, month goes from 0 to 11. It's really kind of weird in my mind. I would think you'd do them all one way or all the other way, but month is just different. So whenever you're dealing with dates in OpenAir scripting or even in JavaScript in general, you got to be a little bit careful. Okay, we are out of time, and I apologize. I'm sure I didn't get to everybody's questions. If you would like to contact us about, if you have some specific questions or whatever, again, my name is Jim Shine here at TopStep. My email address, I will give you that. I should have put it in the presentation, but hang on a minute.
Hello?
Hello? Go back to here. Hello?
Hi.
You can always send something to our support address, support@topstepconsulting.com, and we can get back to you. Otherwise, you can send it to me. Unfortunately, I don't have my name in here, but it's JSCHEIN, N as in Nancy, Jim Shine, at topstepconsulting.com. Be happy to answer any questions you have. You may have to give me a little bit of time, as we are extraordinarily busy these days, which is a good problem to have. But I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. All right. Thank you again.